By the time this gets widespread attention, there's probably going to be even more escalation. But with a dangerous military confrontation that just unfolded in the South China Sea, we need to understand exactly what happened and why this represents a massive shift in Chinese military aggression against Western allies. On October 19th, a Chinese Su-35 fighter jet carried out what can only be described as an aerial assault on an Australian military surveillance aircraft, firing flares at dangerously close range in what Australian officials are calling the most serious military confrontation between the two nations in decades. The incident occurred when an Australian P-8 Poseidon surveillance aircraft was conducting routine operations in international airspace over the South China Sea. What happened next has sent shockwaves through military and diplomatic circles across the Pacific. Australian Defence Minister Richard Marles revealed that the Chinese Su-35 interceptor approached the Australian aircraft and twice released flares very close to the P-8. In military aviation terms, this isn't a warning shot. This is a direct act of aggression that could have easily resulted in a catastrophic mid-air collision and the deaths of the entire Australian crew. The Australian government immediately filed an official diplomatic protest, describing the Chinese aircrew's behavior as unsafe and unprofessional. But that diplomatic language doesn't capture the reality of what actually happened up there. This was a calculated act of military intimidation designed to send a message that China is willing to risk international incidents to assert its territorial claims. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese personally raised the issue during a face-to-face meeting with Chinese Premier Li Qiang in Kuala Lumpur yesterday. Speaking to reporters after the meeting, Albanese said he told the Chinese leader this was an incident of concern for Australia and that friends are able to discuss issues frankly. The carefully diplomatic language masks what was undoubtedly a tense confrontation behind closed doors. But here's what makes this incident even more significant. It's happening in the context of Australia's new $8.50 billion critical minerals deal with the United States, signed just last week during Albanese's visit with President Trump. The timing is no coincidence. China is sending a clear message that economic partnerships with America come with military consequences. The Chinese response has been predictably defiant. Senior Colonel Li Jianjian, a Chinese military spokesperson, accused the Australian aircraft of illegally entering the airspace of China's Shisha Islands without Beijing's approval. He claimed the Australian actions seriously violated China's sovereignty and issued a stern warning for Australia to immediately cease its infringement and provocation. This is classic Chinese propaganda deflection. The incident occurred in international airspace, not Chinese territorial waters. The P-8 Poseidon was conducting lawful surveillance operations in waters that have been international shipping lanes for centuries. But China's increasingly aggressive stance in the South China Sea has turned routine military operations into dangerous confrontations. The pattern of escalation is becoming impossible to ignore. This isn't an isolated incident. In July, Albanese complained directly to President Xi Jinping about Chinese military behavior after a Chinese flotilla conducted naval live-fire exercises off the Australian coast that forced commercial aircraft to change course. That February incident was widely regarded as a display of China's growing military strength and willingness to project power right up to Australia's doorstep. The Australian Prime Minister has also raised concerns about recent clashes between Chinese and Australian military forces in both the South China Sea and Yellow Sea that Australia argues have endangered Australian personnel. The evidence points to a systematic campaign of military intimidation by China against one of America's closest allies. The geopolitical implications here are staggering. Australia finds itself caught between two superpowers, economically dependent on China as its largest trading partner, but militarily aligned with the United States through the ANZUS Treaty and other defense arrangements. China imposed trade barriers in 2020 that cost Australian exporters up to $13 billion annually, demonstrating Beijing's willingness to use economic warfare as a political weapon. With Australia signing major resource deals with America, China has escalated to military intimidation. The message is clear: economic cooperation with our enemies comes with consequences, and those consequences might include putting your military personnel at risk. The critical minerals aspect of this confrontation cannot be understated. China currently dominates global supply chains for rare earth elements essential for everything from smartphones to military equipment. Australia's rich deposits of these materials represent a strategic threat to Chinese economic leverage over the Western world. The $8.50 billion US-Australia deal is specifically designed to break Chinese monopoly control over critical supply chains. China's response has been swift and aggressive. Beyond the aerial confrontation, Chinese state media has been pushing propaganda claiming Australia is discriminating against Chinese investment. Premier Li Qiang told Albanese that China hoped Australia would provide an open, transparent and non-discriminatory environment for Chinese enterprises. This is diplomatic code for demanding Australia reverse its national security restrictions on Chinese ownership of critical infrastructure. But Australia has been moving in the opposite direction. Last year, the Australian government ordered 5 China-linked companies to divest their shares in the rare earth mining company Northern Minerals, citing national security concerns. Australia's foreign investment rules now explicitly prevent Chinese ownership of critical infrastructure, recognizing the strategic vulnerability that such ownership would create. The military confrontation fits into China's broader strategy of using its growing military power to enforce economic compliance from regional neighbors. The Su-35 that confronted the Australian aircraft is a sophisticated air superiority fighter, one of Russia's most advanced designs that China has been incorporating into its rapidly expanding air force. The fact that China is willing to risk international incidents with such expensive military assets demonstrates how seriously Beijing takes the threat to its economic leverage. This incident is particularly dangerous because of the location. The South China Sea is one of the world's busiest shipping routes, with over $3 trillion in trade passing through annually. Military confrontations in these waters risk disrupting global commerce and supply chains that affect billions of people worldwide. China has been building artificial islands and military installations throughout the region in violation of international law, essentially trying to turn international waters into a Chinese lake. The Australian P-8 Poseidon that was targeted is part of a broader Western effort to maintain freedom of navigation in these critical waters. These surveillance flights provide intelligence on Chinese military movements and serve as a deterrent against further territorial expansion. By attacking these operations, China is essentially declaring that it will use force to prevent international monitoring of its military activities. The diplomatic aftermath of this incident reveals the complexity of modern great power competition. Despite the military confrontation, both sides are maintaining diplomatic contact and describing their relationship as stabilizing. This reflects the economic interdependence that makes direct military conflict extremely costly for all parties involved. But it also demonstrates how military intimidation has become a routine tool of international relations. Albanese's description of his meeting with Li Qiang as positive, despite discussing aerial attacks on Australian military personnel, shows how normalized these confrontations have become. We're living in an era where foreign militaries can attack your forces with flares, and it's considered a routine diplomatic discussion point. The broader strategic implications extend far beyond Australia and China. This incident demonstrates China's willingness to escalate military tensions in response to economic partnerships with the United States. As America builds alternative supply chains and reduces dependence on Chinese manufacturing, China is responding with increasingly aggressive military posturing against U.S. allies. For military families and personnel throughout the Pacific region, these confrontations represent a daily reality of increased danger and tension. Australian aircrews conducting routine surveillance operations now face the genuine possibility of military attack by Chinese forces. The psychological impact of operating under constant threat of aggression cannot be understated. The incident also highlights the limitations of current international law and enforcement mechanisms. When a major power like China uses military force against another nation's aircraft in international airspace, the available responses are limited to diplomatic protests and economic sanctions. There's no international court that can effectively constrain Chinese military aggression in real time. This confrontation likely represents an escalation that will be met with increased Western military presence in the region. Australia will probably request additional support from U.S. forces, while China will likely respond with even more aggressive posturing. We're witnessing the early stages of what could become a much larger military standoff in one of the world's most economically critical regions. The fact that this is happening while China still maintains significant economic leverage over Australia through trade relationships demonstrates the complex nature of modern conflicts. Traditional military alliances and economic partnerships are being tested by adversaries willing to use force while maintaining commercial relationships. The most disturbing aspect of this incident is how it's being normalized through diplomatic language and media coverage. An act that would have been considered an attack on a sovereign nation's military forces just decades ago is now described as unsafe and unprofessional behavior, and handled through routine diplomatic channels. This normalization of military aggression represents a dangerous precedent for international relations. If China can attack Australian military aircraft without meaningful consequences, what prevents similar attacks on other nations' forces? The incident over the South China Sea may seem like a regional dispute, but it's actually a test of whether international law and sovereignty mean anything in an era of rising authoritarian powers. The Australian government's measured response, while diplomatically appropriate, may actually encourage further Chinese aggression by demonstrating that such attacks can be carried out without significant consequences. Military deterrence requires credible responses to military provocations, and diplomatic protests may not be sufficient to prevent escalation. Chinese and Australian officials are likely planning their next moves in what appears to be an escalating confrontation over control of critical resources and strategic waterways. The stakes couldn't be higher, not just for these two nations, but for the entire global system of international law and peaceful commerce that has underpinned decades of economic growth and stability.